Hello and welcome to our week on slavery and unfreedom in Canada. Slavery is a difficult topic in Canada. It's difficult because we have such a bad conception of it. We really labor under this misapprehension that slavery didn't exist here. And while it was certainly smaller, less significant in Canada than it was in the United States, it certainly existed here. And I think it's important that we spend some time talking about that and really quite how important it was. It also provides other lessons for us as well in terms of how we think about labor in the New World. The New World and colonization in general was all about power and resources, and it meant obtaining those resources. And there's different ways to get at those resources, and slave labor was one of those. So too was the deployment or use of indigenous labor. So too was use of settlers. So too, as we'll see in a couple of weeks, was use of seasonal workers like in the fisheries in Newfoundland, where they would come over in the spring and return in the fall. Massive amounts of workers moving not on a permanent basis but on a temporary basis. I want to begin here with a little illustration from where I grew up. This is in Halifax. This photograph you're looking at here. This is a church called the Little Dutch Church, and the name is misleading. It's not little. It's certainly little. You can see it's very little. What you can't see in this picture is that it's actually very little. That door, I have to duck to go through that. It's really quite a small little building. You can see it's in a neighborhood of high-rise buildings in Halifax, apartment buildings in Halifax. It's really dwarfed and kind of lost in the landscape now. It's not Dutch. It's German. In German is Deutsch, and that Deutsch got turned into Dutch. It kind of looks like Dutch, and it became the Dutch Church. It's really a German church, a German Lutheran church. I went by this place dozens of times as a child, walking by the place. Friends who lived nearby walked by the place. There's a little plaque. You can see the little plaque there on the left-hand side. It talks about the church. And you know, it's a pretty innocuous thing, but it's a nice little illustration for me of slavery's place in Canadian history, because we tend just simply not to see it. But it was there. Here's an advertisement from the Royal Gazette in Halifax in June of 1800, where you can see somebody is selling a Negro girl, aged 18, good-natured, fond of children, and so on. For particulars, inquire at the old parsonage, Dutchtown. This church. The minister at this church owns an 18-year-old girl. He's selling her. The terms of this suggest she might be an indentured servant, not a slave, but there's certainly dozens of other ads in the papers in the same time period for similar situations that are definitely slaves. Because he's just doing it, you can see, for a term of years, and so it may not be fully a slave transaction. But it may also be a temporary arrangement where he's, in effect, renting her out in some fashion. You used to see that in lots of instances as well. But my point is a simple one, is that this is an example of, a quaint little church, and we would view it as a quaint little church where the German immigrants who came to Halifax in the 1740s came to worship. But they also owned slaves, or minimally some indentured servants. So quickly, what we're going to cover today, we're going to cover some of the basic terms. We'll have a quick look at indigenous slavery, Panis slavery. We'll look at African slave trade in New France, and then we'll pick it up with kind of where we're going in British North America. Of course, we're still in the French period in the course so far, but as after most of you know, the French are defeated in the middle of the 18th century and the British take over. So we'll look at what happens after the British take over. We haven't got there yet in the course, but we'll kind of, just to keep the slavery discussion together, we'll leap ahead to that moment. In terms of discussing some terms, I want to talk about this one first because it's a term you may not be familiar with. It's a slightly abstract term. It's a weird word, unfreedom, and I just thought I'd talk about that for a minute. It's a useful term in discussions of slavery, because there are different forms of slavery and also different forms of labor contracts that are available. We do need to make a distinction between indentured servitude. Both of these are forms of unfreedom. Both of these are forms whereby a person's ability to control their own actions and particularly their labor is surrendered. Though the rules are different and also the time period is different. Slavery is permanent and nobody voluntarily enters slavery. They're captured and made slaves. Indentured servitude is different. Indentured servitude is voluntary. Well, oftentimes these are dirt poor people, so voluntary is limited, but still they're not made to do this. They're not captured and turned into indentured servants. And it's for a limited period of time, typically 5 years, sometimes 7, sometimes 3, but typically a 5-year period. But they become effectively the property of the master. And here the relationship is more like a father-son, a patriarchal relationship, rather than a labor relationship. And in fact, if you look at master-servant relationships and the law of master-servant relationships in the 18th and 19th centuries, they're very much a patriarchal model, very much a family household model. Though slavery works in that basic model as well. So what I want you to see here is that there's a kind of continuum, and that even within slavery, for example, there are different possibilities. Certainly different slaves had different roles, but also different societies had different abilities for the slaves to operate in the societies, and most particularly an ability to free themselves. In Spanish and Portuguese societies, colonies, manumission was very common. Manumission is the process where a slave purchases his or her freedom. And somebody else can purchase, your master can purchase your freedom as well. In other words, they can declare you to be free. Or the slave can save up a certain amount of money and buy themselves from their master and therefore buy their freedom. In the British and French systems, however, that's possible, but it's highly unlikely. It doesn't happen very often at all. So again, you get that kind of sense of a range of possibilities here. And certainly for our discussion, it's fine to we're just going to talk about slavery, although we'll see that there's some play there as well. But there's also a fair big range out there in the broader world that typically we should be keeping track of. I'm going to begin with the Panis slaves, the indigenous slaves. You have a reading on this week, so I'm not going to talk too much about this because your reading quite nicely takes you through some of the forms and some of the differences between indigenous slaves and African American slaves. And really what you're going to see here is two different social, political approaches to the issue of slavery and what it means in those societies. And you'll see they're in some ways they're really quite similar because there certainly is a surrender of one's freedom here. But there's also really different possibilities coming out of slavery in these societies, and also of the treatment of the slave in that society. And certainly you'll see an important distinction on the kind of the notion of property. One of the things that is very important for us is to keep in our minds that slavery is a property relationship. I've heard students often say something like, slaves were treated like they were property. No, they are property. That's the point. They're made property. They're made an exchangeable good. They're stripped of their humanity. That's as much as all the physical cruelties that are imposed on these people, it's really the stripping of the humanity that is probably the most barbaric action in this whole process. You see in the Panis slaves, though there's some stripping of humanity there, there's less of it and also greater possibilities for redemption of some or recovery of some of your humanity in that. So they're really quite different systems. But you'll certainly see that within indigenous societies in North America that slavery was part of those societies, just as it was in the West, though it operated differently. And we'll see that it's a fairly significant form, not just of labor supply, but also of demographic correction, if you will, where some societies capture slaves to make up for lost population and so on. So there's different things going on there. But it's useful for us to see that it's a significant part of the world of labor exchange and politics in this time period. African slavery, unlike in other North American and Caribbean colonies and South American colonies, doesn't really take off in New France. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But certainly the most important of those is the nature of the resources being exploited. In this time period, there's two major resources that we can talk about. There's the cod fishery, mostly off Massachusetts, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. And we're going to talk about that in a separate lecture. But I'll just say really, really quickly here that much of the labor particularly in Newfoundland, but similarly in Nova Scotia and Massachusetts as well. Much of that is temporary labor. People cross the ocean in the spring and return in the fall. So in other words, they're not part of a regular permanent settlement in the colonies. The other major trade is the fur trade. And what we see there is, again, a limited demand for labor on a permanent basis because most of the actual capture of furs is being done by indigenous people. So really all you need from a colonial perspective on the ground is a couple of transportation points, a couple of trading positions. Well, they actually have many of them, but a couple of big ones like at Quebec and Montreal, which will become kind of growth areas in the fur trade, but you won't have to kind of send your people out into the territory to capture those furs because indigenous people are providing that labor. So if you think about something like the sugar plantations, the cotton plantations, and so on, the large plantations that existed in the Caribbean and in the United States South, or what becomes the United States South, those are large, intensive farms that need lots of labor inputs. And they were unable to do that with the free population. So the only other way to do that was to create slave populations. That became a profitable way to achieve an outcome in those large agricultural sectors. But in fishing, you've got fishing people going back and forth from England and Scotland and France all throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And in the fur trade, you've got the indigenous people doing the bulk of the labor, at least in terms of the capture. There's certainly French settlers involved in the exchange, moving out into the country to act as traders out in the country. But they're not staying there permanently. Some are, but we're talking fairly small numbers here compared to what's happening in the settlement colonies, for example, in Massachusetts and Virginia, further to the south, where you have a lot more settlement taking place. And the Caribbean, where you have more settlement, but also huge slave populations. So really it's a different resource regime, a different labor regime that determines whether slavery makes sense. Now you can see by this chart that there were in fact slaves in New France. A lot of them, about 1,000 in Quebec and about 1,500 in Montreal, and another couple hundred in the area around. But compared to the other colonies, these are really quite small numbers. And these tend not to be labor slaves, they tend to be domestic slaves. They tend to be people who are working in people's households, cleaning, looking after children, cooking, that sort of position, rather than the kind of field slave where you're working in the fields or working on a boat or whatever the case may be. So different labor regimes, different productive regimes determine whether we have a need for slavery, at least slavery on that big scale that we see in the Caribbean and in the US South. In the French colonial world, and we have to keep in mind that this is a much broader world than just New France. There are colonies in the Caribbean, colonies in South America, and soon there'll be colonies in Africa as well. And the French need to have rules and regulations to regulate that slave trade. And in France, it comes to be embodied in this work, Le Code Noir, the Black Code, which is first published in 1724, and it regulates slavery in all French territories, including the colonies. It's a really important piece of legislation. It determines not only how the business of slavery is conducted, but also how one treats one's slaves and how the slaves themselves are to respond, how they're to be treated as well. So it prescribes behaviors for the masters, the level of, for example, level of punishment that you can exact on your slaves, but also the punishment that will be prescribed for those slaves who rebel or resist or are somehow acting inappropriately as far as the master is concerned. This is an illustration from French Guiana in the 18th century. It shows a woman with a heavy weight that she's being punished. We don't know what she's done, but she's being punished perhaps for trying to run away or resisting her master in some fashion. But this is her punishment. The weight is chained to her leg, and she is required to hold it over her head. You can imagine this would be difficult to do for a few minutes, but she's going to be made to do it for the entire day. And when she fails to do it, they'll punish her for that as well. So there's nasty punishments built into this. But the Code Noir is also meant to protect the slave too, because it demands that the masters limit the amount of punishments that they offer, and so that, for example, it becomes illegal to actually kill or maim your slaves, although that certainly happens. We have few instances of that kind of extreme kinds of punishment in the Canadian record, but they certainly existed, and certainly the Code Noir and receives significant use in the courts, both by masters trying to recover their property, and sometimes by slaves trying to protect themselves from the excessive abuses of their masters. We should also note that there's a kind of cross current here that that indigenous people, particularly those larger, wealthier groups like the Iroquois, engaged in slavery themselves, including African slavery. This is a collection of sort of small biography refugees of people in Canada after the American Civil War, after the American Revolution rather. But she is an African American slave who is owned by Joseph Brant, one of the chiefs of the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations people who move into Canada after the American Revolution. Joseph Brant owned approximately 30 slaves. Some of them were Panis slaves, indigenous slaves. Some of them were African American slaves. And so, one person does not completely counter an example, but it does show a kind of fairly widespread acceptance of the basics of slavery in all these societies. I also want to show you this quick thing that kind of gives you the sense of the immediacy of slavery in British Canada, so after the defeat of the French in the 7 Years' War. We haven't got there in the course yet. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. But ultimately, the French Empire will be pushed out of Canada. Britain will take over. Here's Halifax, just on the eve of that war, founded in 1749. And you can see, here's a newspaper ad. So the city is only 3 years old at this point in time. And here's a merchant importing slaves from the Caribbean. But we should also note that Halifax is a kind of planned government city. It's not just merchants who happen to land there. It's the British setting it up as a military station in North America. It's a planned military, colonial, imperial center. So they send over 2,000 people to Halifax in 1749 to begin the construction. Almost 20% of those people are slaves. So right from the very foundation, right from the very first, Halifax is built on substantial amounts of slave labor. Now that won't happen in other cities in Canada because they won't be kind of imperial built cities in that same sort of fashion. But it's a useful reminder for us of how central slavery was, but also how just kind of banal and common it was. It was assumed to be part of the field of work in this time period. Most of us in Canada believe there was no slavery, and those who know about slavery often point to this as something that marks us as different. It is something really interesting, but it also needs to be contextualized properly. In 1791, after the American Revolution, and the colony of Upper Canada is created, and they're creating a constitution, in their first sitting of the legislature in 1793, in what's now called Niagara-on-the-Lake, what was then called Newark, which you have no idea where I am in the university right now, but it's right over there, about 10 kilometers. They passed legislation, including a legislation called an Act to Prevent the Further Introduction of Slaves into Upper Canada in 1793. It's interesting legislation because it's the first legislation in the British Empire which somehow formally ends a part of the slave trade. Now, it doesn't make slavery illegal. It's an important distinction. It just forbids the further introduction of slaves into the colony. There are already several hundred slaves in the colony at this point in time, so they will continue to be slaves. But it means that you will not allow it won't be possible to grow that trade. It won't be possible to make it a more significant part of the population. And it was a contentious piece of legislation. It was initially imagined to be an abolition of slavery, which would have made it the first in the British world, or probably in the Western world. Actually, definitely in the Western world, perhaps in the entire world. But they received significant resistance, and you can guess from who? From slave owners. And not surprisingly, slave owners tended to be fairly wealthy, or amongst the wealthier people in society anyhow, and they were therefore fairly powerful. So they were able to effect a compromise, which was this: we'll ban the trade, but you can't take away our slaves. And it's an interesting argument that they get into, and we can't spend a whole lot of time on this, but it really kind of goes to the heart of how politically and economically we define ourselves in Western societies. It's around property. And that becomes the argument of the slave owners. You cannot take away my property. My property is mine. I bought it, I earned it, I own it. And the state shouldn't be taking away my property in the same way that they shouldn't take away somebody's farm or somebody's house or whatever. But you can't take away their property. And the slaves were property. So this becomes part of the discussion and really kind of defines a basic position in Canadian politics centered on property. There's certainly lots of slaves around here in Niagara. Here is a notice from the Niagara Herald in 1802, warning somebody not to conceal this man Charles Fields, his Indian slave. So this is a Panis slave, not an African slave. So he's warning people not to harbor this person, not to protect this person, not to hide this person. That he will expect to be dealt with accordingly when he does capture his property back. Here's another one, runaway notices, also from Niagara newspapers in the 1790s, a Negro wench. The language is remarkable, very harsh language, cruel language, certainly by our standards. A Negro manservant named John. Notice that they often, this woman, the wench, is named Sue. They don't have full names, they just have partial names. And that's part of the whole system of slavery too, but it diminishes these people. It makes them less significant. You do not have a patronage. You do not have a patrilineal naming system. You're just John. You're just Sue. You're just this individual object, but you're not a free individual the way Thomas Butler or James Clark is. But I just want you to see that here in Niagara, there's certainly slaves, and again, these are newspaper ads. These are common, accepted features of life in the 1790s and early 1800s. Comparable ads from Nova Scotia from the 1780s. Nova Scotia being slightly older than Upper Canada by a couple decades. We have this older history. We have ads going back to the 1750s. But you certainly see that, again, that it's part of the ordinary pattern of life in these societies. In Upper Canada, the trade is abolished in 1793, and over a series of court actions over the course of the 1790s and early 1800s, gradually slavery itself is done away with. There's no legislation doing this. It's more a series of court decisions. In Nova Scotia, they never banned the trade, but also had this series of court decisions. And this is the cover of one of them. It's a discussion piece. It's actually not the decision. It's a pamphlet published to discuss the decision. And it's on a court case that's going on in Nova Scotia in the 1790s over, as they say, Negro servitude, but it is about slavery. And it's about the exact law of the land and whether slavery is actually legal in Nova Scotia. It's a long, complicated story, but the upshot is that there are several court cases in the 1780s, 90s, and early 1800s, which consistently, well, not perfectly consistently, but almost consistently rule in favor of the slaves. And these are a whole series of cases where slaves claimed that the law did not actually permit the sale that had been effected upon their bodies. And the courts generally supported that. And the position here was not, however, and this is an important point, was not a moralistic point. They were not saying this is a bad thing. The simple issue was whether slavery and British legislation on slavery applied in Canada or not, or in this case in Nova Scotia or not. And the courts were clear that they saw no reason to believe that British slave law applied in Nova Scotia. There was no indication of it in the instructions to the governors that were sent in the early constitutional documents that were sent over from Britain. And these are usually fairly precise in what should and shouldn't be part of the colonial government. So they saw no reason to support slavery. It's clear that there was probably a moral backing to that position. I mean, it wasn't just an abstract legal reasoning. I'm sure they began with the thought that slavery was wrong and therefore looked for ways in the law to make that case. But they certainly made the case clear that there was no reason in the law, no basis in the law, rather, for supporting that Nova Scotia was a slave state. So by 1810, there are no slaves left in Nova Scotia. There's still a few left in Upper Canada and Lower Canada, not many, but a few. But by 1810, they seem to be gone from Nova Scotia. You see no more reported cases of runaways, and very few instances, no instances actually, of them being passed on as property in wills and so on, or in sales after 1810. So it seems to have completely died out. And so it's a combination of this kind of legal technicality that British law doesn't apply in this area, but also a willingness on the part of legal people, judges, lawyers, to push the argument that it can't have a standing in Canada. Same thing happens in New Brunswick. There's still a clear recognition that it requires discussion, and you can see in this ruling, you can look at, I'm just going to stay here for a second, but if you want to come back to this later, you can see the case of this Negro woman who was claimed as a slave by a man, but the court argues that there's no basis for supporting the imposition of British law in this colony. So the upshot of all this is a simple one, that we have slavery in Canada. It's not a strong or important or critical part of the economy, largely because there's other ways of obtaining the labor that you need to obtain the resources that are governing the colony, running the colony, or the basis for the colony. But that it certainly exists. It exists as an accepted social institution, which with time becomes a less accepted social institution. And certainly when we tend to look at this, we're going to come back, and in a later lecture, we're going to talk about the Underground Railroad and the position of freed American slaves in the Canadas in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. We'll talk about that in a later lecture. A certain smugness comes from that, where we feel good about holding a morally superior position to the Americans. And I think there was really wonderful things done by abolitionist groups in Canada in that time period, and we should be proud of that. It was being done in the United States too. It was being done in the northern states in particular, and in some instances in the southern states as well. But we shouldn't feel too smug about it, because until very, very recently, we had been doing the exact same thing. Not on the same scale, but we had certainly accepted it as part of our societies. Increasingly with time, that acceptance dwindled and eventually just disappeared. But there were certainly slaves in our society, and they were certainly there. But I also want you to keep in mind that they were quite different. And your readings this week really go to that notion, not only that they were there, but they existed in different forms. And that the landscape of slavery, that is, the different possibilities that slavery contained within itself, were expressed pretty fully and completely in different ways across what becomes Canada, particularly in the 18th century. So you're going to have two readings this week. One looks at African-American slaves, one looks at indigenous slaves, and I want you to really focus on a discussion about the differences that existed between those, but of course also the similarities, and draw some conclusions about the character of slavery in Canada in the colonial period. Take care.